It's the Innovation Podcast with Mark Reed Edwards and Garnett Harriman. Let's start the show.
Hey, Garnett, how you doing?
Hey, Mark, how are you doing today?
I'm doing really well. We've got Kai Stinchcombe joining us today, and Kai is founder and CEO of TrueLink Financial, which is billed as a tech-enabled, diversified financial services for retirees. Kai, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you here. Can you tell us a bit about yourself and how your career led you to where you are now?
Yeah, so I sort of was checking all the bullet lists on the Silicon Valley punch card, dropped out of Stanford twice rather than just once, started a nonprofit, and then a really poorly conceived company in sales territory management that after making every mistake you can imagine, we ended up managing to survive as a company now called Octana.
Yeah.
And then, as I was sort of out here doing all sorts of interesting things in technology and actually in sort of social impact also, meanwhile, my grandma was sort of headed downhill with Alzheimer's. And my mom was the one taking care of her primarily. And I would talk to my mom every day while I walked to work. And I sort of couldn't believe some of the problems she was having, and especially around financial management. And, sort of know-it-all grandson that I am, I'm like, look, grandma's not the only person in the world with Alzheimer's. There's 11 million Americans with memory loss related to age. Just tell the bank she has Alzheimer's. And, eventually my mom was like, okay, if you're so smart, you sort it out. And I went from it's totally implausible that there's 11 million people in America with no access to banking to holy crap, there's 11 million people in America with no access to banking. And that was kind of,
right.
I just kind of couldn't stop thinking about it. And when you have that feeling, either you sort of falsify the premise or you end up starting a company.
Yeah. And so there's obviously a real kind of personal connection to this idea about elder tech. So is that really what directly led you to create TrueLink?
Yeah, it's funny because I sort of stumbled into it backwards, and I think it's a much more exciting market than many that other people are chasing. You sort of look at everybody's sort of high on millennials, and this is sort of like by now it's become a little bit of a crusade for me, but I just don't get it. You sort of look at the median dollar is owned by a sort of 59-year-old, I think, and so the under 55 market is a niche market. Right. Yeah. And,
in this world, it seems like once you turn 50, no one's interested in you. Right.
And it's, it's astounding. Right. It's sort of like, millennials are maybe 17% of the market. I mean, it's just, it's like, it's just a write off.
Interesting. And
this is already taking an interesting turn. Huh?
Well, I've got an axe to grind about everything. You guys will see. It'll be an
You're hitting on one of mine, though. I mean, this is I've been in the early stage investment business for 25 years, and I have a serious axe to grind with millennials. So good, all good on you.
But it's also, you can have an axe to grind with them, but it's also about why companies focus on them to the exclusion of people who actually have money, right?
Well, it's interesting because I think it's such a great business in the sense that there is, a real money, but it's also the level of need is just so much higher, right? That you have 7 new companies that are trying to outcompete each other to lose money on millennials. And meanwhile, you have like the other 80% of the market and nobody has a company going after it. And you just you have to scratch your head. And I think some of it is just this sort of like froth factor, right? You sort of look at Silicon Valley and you're like, how many new ways are there to order food at your desk?
Right.
And that's just that's a measure of the kind of level of craziness. But yeah, I had so many moments, our first round of funding, there was this moment in every meeting where, it's like the venture capitalist I was meeting with, it's like his or her eyes would just typically his, unfortunately, right? Eyes would just get big, like all of a sudden he's like Steve Jobs. He's like, this may be a lot bigger than you think. I'm like, no, this is exactly how big I think it is. I've actually thought about this. I know how big it is. And he's like, you could use this debit card that you set up for seniors. I would set that up for my teenager.
Right.
And you're like, oh man, financial services for teenagers. Like, what an amazing market. Like, you're a genius. You know what you should do? You should go to Fidelity and Prudential right now and tell them this retirement thing is for the birds, right? That why are they doing these retirement accounts when they could be doing savings accounts for teenagers? I mean, you're like, it's like the stupidest thing you've ever heard. And, eventually I learned to stop like blaming them for it. But I would start my meetings. I would literally go in there and I would say, you know why I am meeting with you? Because the stupid venture capitalists will tell me I should work on something for teenagers rather than something for seniors. And I know you're not going to say that to me because you are a substantive, smart, and, intelligent, thoughtful person. And that's why I'm having this meeting. And then they stop saying it.
And they just get that out of the way right up front.
Yeah, right. And just sort of, turn it into a compliment. And they're not going to be like, well, actually, I think I'm going to say that thing that you pointed out what a bozo would say.
That sounds like how a meeting with Garnett might go.
in reverse, though. In reverse.
Right? Yeah.
If you started talking to me about millennials, I would put my foot up on the conference room table, look out the window, and and if you started talking about elder tech or, marketing to people with money in a meaningful way, I probably sit up straight and pull up my tie or, kind of do the Eagle Scout thing and listen. So good for you.
Well, and it's one of those interesting things, just, I don't want to go overboard on the money thing because, there are people who are retired who have enough money for retirement. And there's a much larger percentage of people that don't. And, this is sort of in contrast to millennials where nobody has money, right? But the great thing about working with seniors and we're now sort of working with, people with disabilities and people recovering from addiction. And it is that there's a mix, right? So you can both build a viable business and actually kind of help people in need that nobody else cares about. So it's at least not a doomed business in a way that, I don't want to say that Wealthfront or Betterment are doomed, but holy crap, right? It's I think they by my mental math, it's a 30-year payback on your cost to acquire a customer. Neither here nor there.
You were going to say something, Garnett?
Well, I think, part of the thing that's unfolding here is I'm sure Kai's standard investment deck has this in it, but there's a whole bunch of macro trends that are unfolding in his favor, having to do with, medical discoveries and average lifespan and longevity and, the comparative demographics of the developed world versus the developing world. I think a lot of people know sort of half of the demographic story and not the other half. And, so there's essentially a barbell in most places, a huge aging population and then a relatively large, super young population. And the aging population this is essentially static in place. And Kai's earlier point was, everyone's sort of chasing that younger portion of the, any developed nation's population and almost completely ignoring these older groups that are actually just getting older. So, the whole notion of lifetime customer value for them, you used to get laughed out of the room 15, 20 years ago when you started talking about selling to older people. And now it actually kind of makes sense from a demographic and actuarial standpoint.
Well, and it's interesting because people would sort of, just jumping right to talking about death because the conversation's already going so well. And it's just, it's a fact of life, right? So perhaps the most fundamental fact of life, in fact. But, investors would say, let's talk about, kind of what's your customer lifetime. And I'm like, I would just give them this stone stare and be like, I can't believe you said that. They're like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I'm like, no, just kidding. But, you sort of think that if you get a millennial customer, you'll be with them for their entire life. And it's just this sort of fake theory, right? It's you imagine selling somebody a Disney lunchbox and being like, I'm going to be this person's catering service 20 years from now. And it's no, when people's needs change, they actually adopt new services that fit their needs. And so actually any financial service is with you for a life stage. And I think Wealthfront and Betterment have both seen this actually, that when their customers need a, sort of something a little more substantive, they leave and everybody has this sort of $10,000 Wealthfront they set up, that 1 year where their New Year's resolution was to save for their retirement. And then they realize actually smarter to save for a mortgage. And then, they've got college tuition and then they're 40 years old and they're like, oh my God, I didn't save for retirement. This is a disaster. And they start, saving then and they're with Merrill Lynch or something.
Yeah. Because their needs and their tastes change, right?
Right. And I think Betterment has done a reasonably good job adapting to this. I mean, you look at their website right now, and there's nobody under 40 on it, right? So to their credit, they gave up on their stupid idea.
So can you tell us about the debit card you created and how it works?
Sure. So the underlying observation is that when anyone keeps a budget, it relies on memory to work, right? You have a certain amount that you can afford to spend. And if you've spent however much of it you've spent, that's how much you can't spend today.
Right.
And if you start to lose your memory, then the amount that you've spent disappears, right? You have no memory of any recent transactions. And so if you used to, from time to time, make a charitable contribution, enter a sweepstakes, join a travel club, sign up for a new magazine, buy a garden gnome, make a gift to a family member or a housekeeper, that would have been a reasonable thing. You wouldn't do it every day, right? But if you don't remember that you did it yesterday, then you wake up in the morning and it's a reasonable thing to do today. And so, and that, that's sort of like, that is what it is. It is hard to impossible to budget if you have Alzheimer's or dementia. But based on that, there are whole industries that have emerged to sort of take advantage of this fact, right? So you think about, like, if you look at the way charitable solicitation is done, if you look at the sort of, crap that gets sold on TV, if you look at, nutritional supplements, it's always like, cancel with no obligation in 30 days, right? And it's designed for people who will forget to cancel. That's like the whole purpose of that industry. And it's actually, it's a very large and lucrative industry. And you see it across the board. You see it. Somebody needs to write a tell-all about, sort of vicious fundraising from people with Alzheimer's from political parties.
Yeah.
Because it's really there.
Yeah. And the volume of calls that I get for things like that is unreal. And I just don't answer them. But some people
Right.
always pick up their landline, and that's how they get victimized.
Right. And so the purpose of the debit card is, if you, at the outset, when we first conceived of it, it was, if you have this particular specific problem, which is an inability to remember recent transactions, which again, about 11 million people have,
Mm-hmm.
then your bank will tell you you can't carry a debit card or credit card or checkbook anymore. That was the situation my grandma was in. And the point is, you should be able to still go get coffee with your army buddies or take your friends out for ice cream. But if somebody's trying to take your money with one of these sort of charitable things, or the garden gnomes, sold on TV or whatever, we can just block the charge. And so, and this was this sort of pivotal moment in our sort of journey starting the company, was realizing, all we wanted to do was be able to decline certain transactions. And it was like, it has to be your logo on the card in order to decline a transaction. And so we ended up having to start a card company.
I see. So is that a unique ability with the debit card, that you can cancel, specific transactions? I mean, I've lost my debit card and had to call up my bank and, saw a transaction that wasn't mine and they canceled it. But do you have a unique piece of functionality around that?
Yeah. So if you called up your bank and said, hey, every day for the last month, I've made a charitable contribution to a different charity and I need to cancel all of that, that's when the bank says, look, that's, at the end of the day, that's your problem, not ours. We can't solve that problem for you. And so if it's one thing because of a lost credit card, that's, like the Visa liability guarantee or whatever. And actually, it's the bank eating that charge.
Yeah.
So if your legitimate spending is going to get coffee with your army buddies once a month, and your illegitimate spending is donating $50 a day and 3 $10 or $20 donations over the phone, they will definitely not eat $1,000 of charges a month in order to get that 3 cents on the coffee.
Yeah, got it.
So for us, it's, it's about understanding your kind of life situation and then blocking the charge as it's happening, right? So we will, prevent whether it's a charitable solicitation or whatever, from taking your money.
So do you use AI or machine learning? How do you spot those things?
I'd love to say yes. And there was a time when I would have kind of, fudged that question. But the truth is no, it's just really actually pretty straightforward. You're sort of like, and I would say this is like a lesson that, you and I are giving away for free to all your listeners today, is that there's like the customer insight problem is typically harder than the technology problem. And so if you're saying, great, we've got AI for credit cards, it's like, what's the problem you're trying to solve? And then if it turns out, like this situation that I sort of bring up, right, with is dad getting coffee with his army buddies or donating to charities, soliciting money over the phone, you're like, you don't even need AI. It's just literally, is he getting coffee with his army buddies?
Hey, I have a real world question based on being actually almost on the I'm almost old enough to be one of your customers. Unfortunately for me.
We're lucky to have you.
You're a kind man. So I'm 50 and my mom.
Put my name in the who referred you field.
so you get the VIG.
Just kidding, I won't actually.
You get the VIG.
I won't actually.
I'll whack up the. Hey, I'm an investor. I'll whack up the VIG with you 50%. How about that? We'll just go heads up on the VIG. So my mom is maybe 80 at this point, I think, maybe just on the cusp of 80. And I'm curious about anything that you've done, any apps or widgets or features that are attached to the card or anything to do with managing the card online that help adult children of your, let's say your elderly customers, deal with, the grief of like managing this stuff, right? So I have a jerry-rigged solution that I've been using before you guys got your first round of funding. I've been using this for several years. We have just a PayPal debit card. And she has one and I have one, and I have the settings such that I can see every single, I'll repeat, purchase that's made on that card.
Yeah.
Now, the problem with that is, when she does ice cream for her church buddies and, a banana bread at the church bake sale, my mom's really religious, that kind of stuff. My email box on certain days, like Sunday, let's say, is like, overflowing with stuff related to my mom. And I'm sort of honor bound to make sure each one of those things, it's just a pain in the ass, Any apps or tools or widgets for helping adult children manage their parents' spending?
So that's literally exactly what we do.
Okay.
This is the insight. You don't want, and again, this is the sort of like AI, right? If you ask PayPal, just let me know about suspicious transactions, they won't know. Right. But for us, because we're built for this precise situation, you can sort of say, like, these ones are fine. I expect the following to go on. You might say, alert me about cash withdrawals or charitable contribution or any purchase. Here's a common one. You might say any purchase made over the phone or online, but then it turns out that actually you don't care about ride hailing or taxis. You don't care about food delivery. You don't care about utility bills paid over the phone. And there's one other thing that you typically don't care about. But the point is, we know this because this is all we do. And so if you sign up, it'll literally you'll spend 2 minutes setting it up and it'll actually do what you want.
So years ago, this is a little precursor. You seem to have some history, and I appreciate the fact that you tried multiple ventures before you got to this one, which seems to be, have the potential to be a winner.
The other ones miraculously ended up winners also, but it was despite them being bad ideas.
I've been looking at elder tech since like 2004-ish, but back then it was not super high tech, right? It was basically like Brookstone for older people. It was like beta for older people. And, I lived from 2002 to 2008, I lived in Denver and ran a fund. And one of the things I put personal money, actually not fund money, into was this, like a small chain of maybe less than 6 stores in and around Denver and Boulder and a couple of other places that had, this is going to sound stupid, but things like large print books, magnifying glasses, translators, digital translators, grabbers, all sorts of sensors for the person or for the house, stuff like that. Like super low.
All right, I need the punchline. How did it go?
Well. They're still doing quite well for itself. It was cash on cash, like a really attractive business.
Yeah, right. That whole revenue thing really just sometimes, it's just so relevant to how well the business is doing.
When is it not relevant?
Well, there's 12 square miles here in Silicon Valley.
No, exactly.
Where that's sort of an afterthought. It's interesting. This is a diversion, but there was a company, Sabi, which I don't know if it made it, but it was the coolest company in our little cohort of elder tech, and it was basically just sort of like high concept design for sort of like aging baby boomers. And the thing that the founder would always say, he would always talk about the tennis balls on walkers, right? And you're like, it is so ugly, right? And you're like, tennis balls. It's like if there was no way to wear glasses without putting tape on the bridge of the nose, right? It's like, why is it acceptable that this thing that, millions of people rely on and will continue to, that they're like, oh, just, like take a scissor to a tennis ball and add that to this thing you're wearing. And he was like, why shouldn't this be, fashionable? Why shouldn't the stuff around aging make you feel good, just like everybody else's, stuff that they carry around? And so it was like these sort of like high design canes, and, like grab bars in the shower that, it's like there's this like beige plastic and stainless steel aesthetic, which is like nobody's aesthetic at all. And yet that's how you make a grab bar in the shower or a walker or, pretty much everything associated with aging.
When I'm old enough, I want my grab bar to be like solid gold fucking plated.
Yeah. Like Donald Trump's toilet, right?
or like some cartel guy or some like really old cartel guy.
Like something out of Narcos or something
there
like
you
that,
go.
right? Yeah. So how about the big banks and financial services companies? Are any of them getting wind of what you're doing? If they any noise?
I would say, a lot of noise. No, gosh, I'm trying to complete the metaphor. A lot of hat, no cattle.
All hat.
But, I think it's genuinely challenging. I think it's a challenging problem. And, it's like everybody has their strategy, right? So, Wells Fargo, for example, like fake customers are easier to get than real customers. I don't know. But, I guess the thing that we think about, as we sort of like style the business is TIA or USAA, to a lesser extent, American Express or First Republic or SoFi. But there are genuine, kind of categories of demographically segmented financial services. So TIA financial services for college professors, USAA financial services for military families, Amex for business travelers, SoFi for yuppies, First Republic for the very wealthy. And each of them has a set of benefits or perks that are specific to their audience. And really, again, it's like a customer insight thing, right? So it's not thin, right? But at First Republic, you can just, you get done with your meeting, you're like, hey, can I grab a conference room for the next hour? I got a phone call. And, of course you can, right? It's First Republic. Mm-hmm. And if you ask for that at USAA, they don't have that. It's not valuable, right? Amex has the frequent flyer lounges, which again, if you're a First Republic customer, you already have access to that. And if you're a USAA customer, it's not relevant for you, right? There's the USO lounge. So each one has a different kind of set of like functionality that is super demographically specific. And that's kind of where we see ourselves. And by the way, again, I think it's important, right? Like TIA and USAA are among a small number of companies in financial services that I actually admire, right? You look at that and you're like, I'd be proud to work there. I'd be proud if that was the kind of company that I'd started. But, it's also pretty lucrative, right? USAA, 11 million members, $20 billion a year of revenue. TIA has less than 6 million members and does $30 billion a year of revenue. So it's, it's not like, and it's interesting because today, if you went out to venture, if USAA didn't exist and you went out to venture and said, we're doing financial services for military families, they'd be like, why are you starting a small business? Like, why don't you do something ambitious?
Millennials.
Right? This is like a $20 billion. Yeah, exactly. Right. And it's like it's a $20 billion
in the military.
It's not like
exactly.
By the way, the thing about USAA that always has impressed me, and no one in my extended families, multiple people have USAA, but in my nuclear family, no one. Mm-hmm. But business partners from the past and friends parents and stuff, I've had all these contacts with USAA, and I'm just blown away. It's close, as far as I can tell, it's close to 100% customer approval. It's astonishing.
It's insane, right? It's
astonishing.
It's an 89 net promoter score, which, interestingly, the top 5 net promoter scores in financial services are USAA, TIA, Amex, First Republic, and SoFi. Right? It's literally the 5 companies I just mentioned, and it's all demographic segmentation.
Yep.
Another fun fact about demographically segmented financial services, lovely story about a company called Bank of Italy, which back in the day, the sort of here in San Francisco, like the fruit pickers and the dock workers and so on were Italian immigrants. And this is like the era of no Irish need apply. There was just so much racism against, new Catholic European immigrants. And so the Protestants wouldn't make loans to them. And so this dude started a company called Bank of Italy to make high quality loans to Italian immigrants. And it was so successful, he renamed it Bank of America.
Wow.
Yeah, cool, right?
And then went on to really big things like mortgage fraud.
All the big things, yeah. That's great.
But the point is you can dominate a market for the first 100 years before you lose your way,
sure.
Right? Sure. I mean, I think, it's, and again, not to sort of talk trash about, elders and betters, but, I don't think it's an accident that when Amex decided to make its foray into prepaid, it was at the same time that, the sort of Starwood Rewards and other, Chase Sapphire and so on, started eating into their market of business travelers, right? High-end business travelers. And I think they sort of, they were chasing something that wasn't theirs and meanwhile, took their eye off the ball.
Okay, that's part one. Kai will be back with us next time to continue the discussion. We'll hear about the TrueLink business model, how TrueLink also helps people with disabilities, the size of the market, and lots more. Coming in the weeks ahead, we'll chat with experts Bruno Aguiar about the world of esports and Mark Gallagher about innovation in the world of F1. We also have chats planned on facial recognition and lots of other subjects. So next time, part 2 of our chat with Kai. Stay with us.
Thanks for joining Garnett and Mark on the Innovation Podcast. Visit innovationpodcast.co to subscribe and listen to other episodes.